My husband didn't introduce me at his company party. But when the CEO walked in, he looked straight at me and said, "I've been searching for you." The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, the kind of place where every glass of champagne cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week, and yet somehow I had never felt smaller than I did standing there in my navy dress, clutching a clutch purse that suddenly felt too simple, too quiet, too invisible, while Daniel stood just a few feet away laughing with people who didn't even know my name, or worse, people he made sure would never know it. I had spent the entire afternoon getting ready for that night, carefully styling my silver hair the way he used to say made me look elegant, choosing the one dress he once told me made me look like the woman he fell in love with, and for a moment, just a small moment before we left the house, I believed this night meant something, that after years of standing behind him, supporting his long hours, his risks, his endless ambition, he was finally proud enough to bring me into the light with him. But the illusion cracked the second we stepped inside that grand hotel ballroom, because instead of taking my hand, instead of introducing me as his wife, Daniel leaned in and whispered, "Just stay here for a bit, I need to talk to some people first," and then he walked away without looking back, leaving me standing near a table of strangers who smiled politely but never asked who I was, as if they had already been given an answer that didn't include me. I watched him move from group to group, confident, charming, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear pieces of conversations that never once included the word wife, and when a tall man with a glass of whiskey asked him casually, "So, did your wife make it tonight?" Daniel hesitated for half a second before letting out a soft laugh and saying, "Oh no, she prefers to stay home, big crowds aren't really her thing." And something inside me went very still, not broken, not shattered, just quiet in a way that felt colder than anything I had ever known because I was standing right there, less than 20 feet away, erased in a single sentence as if I had never existed at all. I didn't confront him, I didn't call his name, I didn't even move toward him, because after 68 years of life, after decades of marriage, you learn that the loudest truths are often the ones spoken without raising your voice, and so I stayed where I was, observing, noticing how easily people accepted his version of reality, how smoothly he slipped me out of the narrative of his life, how natural it had become for him to succeed alone, to shine alone, to exist as if the years we built together were nothing more than a footnote he could choose to omit. The music softened as more guests filled the room, the energy shifting in a way that told me someone important had just arrived, and conversations began to redirect, bodies subtly turning toward the entrance, a ripple of attention moving across the ballroom like a current, and I followed it without thinking, my eyes landing on a man stepping through the doors with a presence that didn't demand attention but commanded it anyway, the kind of presence that comes from years of power worn quietly. And as he moved through the crowd, greeting people with a calm confidence, his gaze suddenly lifted, scanning the room with a focus that felt different from everyone else's, sharper, searching, until it stopped completely and unmistakably on me. For a brief second I thought I must be mistaken, that he was looking past me at someone else, someone more important, someone who belonged in a room like this, but then he changed direction, walking straight toward me with purpose, and as he got closer, I saw recognition in his eyes, not curiosity, not politeness but recognition, as if he had known me long before this moment, and when he finally stood in front of me, the noise of the room fading into something distant and irrelevant, he smiled gently and said, "I've been searching for you." And in that instant I realized that the story my husband had been telling everyone in that room was about to change in a way he never saw coming. I did not answer him right away because something in his voice made time feel different, slower, heavier, as if every second carried more meaning than it should. And I simply looked at him, trying to understand why a man like that, a man everyone in that room seemed to orbit around, would walk past executives and investors just to stand in front of someone my own husband had just erased. And for a moment I wondered if he had mistaken me for someone else, someone who belonged in his world, someone important, but then he said my name quietly and clearly, Margaret Hayes, and the sound of it, spoken with certainty, sent a small ripple through my chest that I could not explain because it had been a long time since I had heard my name spoken like that, not as an afterthought, not as an obligation, but as if it mattered. I straightened slightly, not out of pride but out of instinct, and said, "I believe you have the advantage, sir," because that was how I had been raised, to remain composed even when I did not understand what was happening, and he smiled in a way that suggested he respected that, not the forced politeness that filled most conversations in that room, but something steadier, something older, and he replied, William Carter. As if the introduction was unnecessary. As if we both already knew who he was, which of course everyone did, but then he added, "And I owe you an apology for taking so long to find you." And that was when I felt the first real shift, subtle but undeniable, because people nearby had started to notice, conversations thinning out, glances drifting toward us, curiosity building in quiet waves. I could feel it in the air, the way attention gathers before anyone dares to interrupt, and I became aware of Daniel somewhere behind me, not because I saw him but because I felt the change in his energy, the pause in his laughter, the slight hesitation that comes when something does not fit the version of reality you have carefully constructed. And yet I still did not turn around because for the first time that night, I did not feel like the person waiting to be acknowledged, I felt like the person being sought. "I am afraid I do not understand," I said, keeping my voice even, and William nodded as if he expected that, as if this moment had been playing out in his mind long before it reached mine, and he said, "That is exactly why I needed to speak with you directly, not through intermediaries, not through records, but with you." And the word intermediaries lingered in my thoughts, connecting to something distant, something I had not considered in years, because there had been a time, long before Daniel's company dinners and polished presentations, when my life had intersected with people who built things from the ground up, people who understood risk and loyalty in ways that did not always make it into official documents. I remembered sitting at a kitchen table more than 30 years ago, papers spread out in front of me, offering advice that no one had asked for but everyone eventually relied on, and for a fleeting second I wondered if that past, the one Daniel rarely mentioned and often simplified into something smaller, had not disappeared at all but had simply been waiting. "You were involved in the early restructuring of Carter Industries, were you not?" William continued, and this time his voice was softer, not for secrecy but for respect, and the words landed with a quiet weight that made the room feel different again, because they carried history, not rumor, not assumption but history, and I saw it then, the way a few people nearby reacted, the slight widening of eyes, the quick exchange of looks, because even if they did not know me, they understood what that meant. I let out a slow breath, not because I was nervous but because I had not expected that part of my life to return in such a public, undeniable way, and I said, "That was a long time ago." Which was true, but it was not the whole truth because time does not erase impact, it only buries it beneath newer stories, and William's expression did not change. He simply nodded and said, "Long enough for many to forget, but not long enough for it to stop mattering." And in that moment something settled. Inside me, something that had been shifting quietly since the beginning of the evening, taking shape now with clarity, because I understood what was happening, not fully, not every detail, but enough to recognize that the version of me Daniel had presented to the world was incomplete, and more importantly, it was about to be corrected. I finally turned my head slightly, just enough to see him across the room, standing still for the first time that night, his glass untouched in his hand, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and calculation, and I did not feel anger when I looked at him. I did not feel the urge to confront or explain, because the truth was already moving toward him without my help, unfolding in a way that did not require my voice to be raised or my dignity to be defended. And as I turned back to William, I allowed myself the smallest, calmest smile, the kind that does not ask for attention but holds it anyway, and I said, "Then perhaps you should tell me what it is you have been searching for," knowing that whatever he said next would not just change how that room saw me, it would change how Daniel understood the woman he thought he could hide. William did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, not uncertain, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to say and chose to let it settle before speaking. And when he finally did, his voice remained calm but carried a quiet authority that did not need to rise above the music to be heard. "I have been reviewing the original advisory records from our earliest expansion phase," he said, and as he spoke, I could see the pieces forming in the minds of those close enough to listen, because words like original and advisory did not belong to casual conversation at a party like this, they belonged to decisions, to foundations, to things that shaped companies before anyone else noticed them. And he continued, "There was a name that kept appearing in those documents, not as a signature, not as a title, but in the notes, in the margins, in the strategy that guided decisions we still benefit from today." And I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because I remembered those margins, those late nights when ideas were discussed over coffee instead of contracts, when nothing felt official but everything mattered. And I had never expected those thoughts to survive beyond the moment they were needed. let alone resurface decades later in a room full of people who measured value in quarterly reports and polished presentations. Your recommendations were never formalized under your name, William said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only acknowledgement. But they shaped the direction of several critical investments, including the restructuring that allowed us to survive our most unstable period. And now the silence around us had grown more defined, no longer just curiosity but attention, the kind that pulls people closer without them realizing it. And I could feel the edges of conversations dissolving as more ears turned toward us, because even those who did not know the specifics understood the implication that something significant had been overlooked or perhaps deliberately simplified, and that realization made people uneasy in a way they could not quite articulate. I kept my expression steady, though inside I was revisiting memories I had long placed in the past, moments when I spoke freely because no one was listening closely enough to attach importance to it, moments when I offered perspective simply because it felt necessary, not because I expected recognition, and I said quietly, those were informal conversations, not contributions, because that was how I had always framed it, how it had been framed for me. But William shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just certain. Impact does not require a title, he replied, and that simple sentence carried more weight than any formal acknowledgement I had ever received, because it did not ask permission to redefine the narrative, it simply did. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of movement, a shift in posture, the subtle friction of shoes against polished floors, and I knew Daniel was closer now, not because he wanted to join the conversation, but because he needed to understand it, needed to regain control of something that was no longer following the path he had set. And I did not turn to look at him, not yet, because this moment was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, and clarity does not need to be rushed. We have been attempting to identify you for some time, William continued, but the records were incomplete, and the references we followed led nowhere definitive. And I understood then what he meant, not just missing paperwork, but missing context, missing truth, the kind that gets filtered through years of retelling until only the most convenient version remains. And I could not help but think about how easily my role had been reduced in Daniel's version of our story, how naturally he had stepped into the spotlight while I receded into the background until even he seemed to believe that was where I belonged. I did not know anyone was looking, I said, and it was not a defense, just a statement, and William gave a small nod. That is precisely the problem, he said, and there was something in his expression then, something that suggested this was not just about the past, not just about correcting a record, but about something still unresolved, something that extended into the present in ways I had not yet considered. The room felt different now, not louder or quieter, but more focused, as if a spotlight had shifted without anyone noticing the mechanism behind it, and I became aware of how people were watching not just him, but me, assessing, recalibrating, trying to fit this new information into the framework they had already accepted, and I realized that the version of me Daniel had presented was unraveling quietly, without accusation, without resistance, simply because it could not withstand the weight of what was being revealed. There is one more reason I needed to speak with you, William said, and this time there was a subtle change in his tone, not hesitation but intention, as if we were approaching the part of the conversation that mattered most, and I felt my attention sharpen, not with anxiety, but with a kind of calm readiness, because whatever came next, I understood now that it would not diminish me. It would define something that had been left incomplete for far too long, and as he began to speak again, I finally allowed myself to turn fully, meeting Daniel's gaze across the room, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained, because the truth had already stepped into the light, and it was no longer something he could ask me to hide. William held my gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring whether I was ready to hear what came next. And then he spoke with a clarity that seemed to quiet the last fragments of conversation around us. The advisory notes attributed to you were not just helpful suggestions, Margaret, they were foundational and, more importantly, they were tied to a contingency structure that was never fully executed, and I felt the meaning of his words settle slowly, like something long buried beginning to rise, because contingency structures were not casual ideas, they were safeguards, protections designed for moments when everything else failed. And I searched my memory, not frantically but carefully, retracing the years when Daniel and I sat at that small kitchen table with stacks of paperwork and plans that felt too ambitious for the life we were living at the time. And then it came back to me, not as a single moment but as a series of quiet decisions, discussions about risk, about control, about what would happen if things did not go the way they were supposed to, and I remembered insisting on something Daniel had dismissed as unnecessary, a protective layer that ensured influence could not be erased simply because it was inconvenient. There was a provision, William continued, embedded informally in the early restructuring strategy, one that required acknowledgement of original advisory influence before any major transfer of executive control could be finalized. And now the implications were impossible to ignore, because in a room full of people who understood power, the idea that control could hinge on something as overlooked as an undocumented advisor was enough to shift the balance of every assumption they had walked in with, and I could see it in the way a few of them straightened slightly, their attention sharpening not just out of curiosity but calculation. That provision was never formally activated, he said, because we could not locate you. And there was no accusation in his voice, only a statement of fact, but I understood what he was really saying, that something significant had been left incomplete, not because it lacked value, but because it lacked visibility, and visibility, I realized, had been the one thing Daniel had quietly controlled all these years. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of those years rearrange themselves into something clearer, something that no longer felt like quiet support but like overlooked authority, and I said, "And now that you have found me," keeping my tone even, not assuming, not demanding, just acknowledging the shift that was already taking place, and William nodded once, a small deliberate motion. "Now that I have found you, we can proceed correctly," he replied, and the word correctly carried more weight than anything else he had said because it implied that everything up until this moment had been incomplete, not wrong, not fraudulent, but incomplete in a way that mattered. Behind me, I heard Daniel's voice for the first time since this conversation began, not loud, not aggressive, but controlled in a way that revealed effort. "Margaret," he said, and there was a slight edge to it, the kind that appears when someone is trying to reassert familiarity in a situation that has slipped beyond their control, and I turned slowly, meeting his eyes fully now, and for a brief second, I saw something there I had not seen in years: uncertainty, not about who I was but about what I represented in that moment, and it was not anger that filled me, it was clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. "I did not realize you were here," he added, and the sentence hung between us, thin and fragile, because we both knew it was not entirely true. He had known I was there. He had simply chosen a version of the evening that did not include me, and I did not challenge him on it, because the truth did not need my help anymore. It was already unfolding in front of him. William shifted his attention briefly toward Daniel, not dismissively, but with the quiet authority of someone who did not need permission to redirect a conversation, and said, "Mr. Hayes, I was just explaining to your wife that her early advisory contributions are directly tied to a pending structural review." And the word wife landed differently this time, not soft, not secondary, but precise, deliberate, and I saw the effect it had, not just on Daniel, but on the people around us, because titles matter in rooms like that, not for ego but for clarity, and suddenly there was no ambiguity left about who I was. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not visibly enough for most people to notice, but I knew him well enough to see it, the calculation, the rapid reassessment of a situation that no longer fit the narrative he had been presenting all evening, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond, and that silence, brief as it was, said more than anything he could have offered. I turned back to William, not to exclude Daniel, but because the conversation had already moved beyond him, and I said, "What exactly does that review involve?" Not as a question of permission but of understanding, because I had spent too many years being adjacent to decisions without being invited into them, and I was no longer willing to remain in that space. William's expression softened slightly, not in sympathy but in recognition, and he said, "It involves correcting the foundation before we build anything further," and something about that sentence settled into me with a quiet certainty, because foundations, once acknowledged, cannot be ignored without consequence, and as I stood there, in a room where I had arrived as an afterthought, I realized that I was no longer the person waiting to be included. I was the person the structure had been waiting for all along. For a moment, no one spoke, and that silence felt heavier than any argument could have been, because it was not empty, it was filled with realization, with the quiet understanding that something fundamental had just shifted in a room where control was usually predictable, and I could feel it in the way people stood a little straighter, in the way their attention no longer drifted back to casual conversations but remained anchored to what was unfolding between William, Daniel, and me, as if they understood that whatever happened next would not be a spectacle, but a correction. Daniel finally stepped closer, closing the physical distance that had existed all evening as if proximity alone could restore the balance he had lost, and when he spoke, his tone was carefully measured. Margaret has always been supportive, of course, but I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the extent of her involvement, and the word supportive hung in the air like something fragile, something that might have held weight in another context, another time, but here now it sounded smaller than it ever had before, reduced to something that did not match the conversation we were having. I did not interrupt him, I did not contradict him, I simply listened, because there is a moment when someone reveals more by trying to control a narrative than by letting it unfold, and this was that moment. William turned his head slightly toward Daniel, not dismissing him, not challenging him directly, but acknowledging his presence with a calm that made any attempt at correction feel unnecessary. Support can take many forms, he said evenly, but what we are discussing is not support, it is structural influence, and that distinction settled into the space between them, with a clarity that required no further explanation, because everyone in that room understood the difference between being present and being foundational. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, the smallest shift that only someone who had known him for decades would notice, and I recognized it immediately, the effort to maintain composure while recalculating, while trying to determine whether to push back or step back, and for the first time he chose the latter not because he agreed but because he did not yet understand the full extent of what he was up against. I remained still, not out of hesitation, but because movement was no longer necessary. Everything that needed to be seen was already visible, and everything that needed to be understood was already unfolding. The review will require formal acknowledgement, William continued, now addressing both of us but with his attention clearly anchored to me. And once that acknowledgement is established, certain decisions that have been pending will need to be revisited. And I understood the implication immediately, not because he spelled it out, but because I had once been part of those kinds of decisions. I knew how structures worked, how influence flowed through them, how a single overlooked element could delay or reshape outcomes for years, and I realized that what had been invisible for so long was now becoming central in a way that could not be ignored or simplified. What kind of decisions? Daniel asked, and there was a slight shift in his voice now, not uncertainty exactly but caution, as if he was stepping into unfamiliar ground and trying to understand its boundaries before committing to a position, and William answered without hesitation. Executive restructuring, equity adjustments, and long-term governance planning, and each of those phrases carried its own weight, its own implications, not just for the company, but for the people who believed. They already understood their place within it. I saw it then, clearly, the realization beginning to form behind Daniel's eyes, not complete, not fully articulated, but enough to unsettle the certainty he had walked into that room with, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he remembered those early conversations as I did, if he recalled the nights when we spoke about risk and control, about what it meant to build something that could not be easily taken away or rewritten, or if those memories had been reshaped over time into something more convenient, something that fit the story he now told himself. Margaret, he said again, and this time my name sounded different, not an afterthought, not a quiet dismissal, but something closer to a question, as if he was trying to understand who I was in this new context. And I met his gaze calmly, not offering explanation, not softening the moment because there was nothing left to clarify, only something left to acknowledge. I believe it would be appropriate to continue this discussion in a more formal setting, William said, his tone steady, not dismissing the room but elevating the conversation beyond it. But I wanted to ensure that you were present for this initial step, and I understood what he meant, that this was not just about information, it was about recognition, about restoring something that had been overlooked not just in records, but in perception, and I felt a quiet sense of alignment settle within me, not triumph, not vindication, but something steadier, something that had nothing to do with the people around me and everything to do with the truth of what I had always been. I gave a small nod, not dramatic, not performative, just enough to acknowledge that I understood, and as I did, I noticed how the room had shifted once more, not dramatically, but subtly, the way it always does when a narrative changes and people begin to adjust their understanding without quite admitting it. And for the first time that evening, I no longer felt like I was standing in someone else's story. I felt like I had stepped back into my own. The conversation did not end with that statement, but something in the air made it clear that the evening itself had already shifted beyond what it was meant to be. And as William stepped slightly to the side, acknowledging a few individuals who had been waiting patiently but had not dared interrupt, I found myself standing still for a moment longer, not because I was uncertain, but because I was recalibrating, quietly aligning who I had been with what had just been revealed. And that alignment did not feel sudden or dramatic, it felt inevitable, like something that had always been there simply coming back into focus. Daniel remained where he was, closer now than at any point earlier in the evening, yet somehow more distant, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, as if he was trying to contain something that did not yet have a clear form. "We should talk," he said, and it was not a request, not quite a demand either, but something in between, something shaped by habit rather than intention, and I turned toward him fully this time, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without softness, but without hostility as well, because anger would have been misplaced, it would have reduced the moment to something smaller than it was, and this was not small. "We are talking," I replied, my tone even not challenging, simply factual, and for a second he seemed unsure how to respond to that, because the conversation he wanted was not the one that was happening. He wanted something private, contained, something he could manage, and what was unfolding now was none of those things. Around us, the room had begun to reassemble itself, conversations restarting in fragments, though not quite as freely as before, because attention, once shifted, does not immediately return to its original place, and I could feel the subtle awareness of others lingering, not intrusive but present, like a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed even if they could not yet define it. "You never mentioned any of this," Daniel said finally, and there was a note in his voice that might have been frustration or confusion, or something more complex that did not fit neatly into either category, and I considered his words carefully before responding, not because I needed time, but because I understood that what I said next would not just answer his question, it would redefine it. "You never asked," I said, and the simplicity of that sentence carried more truth than anything longer or more detailed could have, because it was not an accusation, it was an observation, one that stretched back years, across conversations that had never happened, across assumptions that had quietly replaced curiosity, across a life where certain parts of me had simply been left unexplored because they were not immediately useful. He held my gaze, searching for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a contradiction, but there was none to offer, only the quiet clarity of what had always been there, and for a moment I saw the distance between us not as something that had suddenly appeared, but as something that had been growing gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it became visible in a room full of people who had nothing to do with it. "This is not the place for this," he said, and this time there was more certainty in his voice, not because he was more confident, but because he was trying to reestablish familiar ground, and I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because he was right in one sense. This was not the place for a private conversation, but it had become the place where something private had been revealed, and there was no undoing that. "Then we will not have it here," I said, and there was a quiet finality in my tone that seemed to settle the matter without needing further discussion, and for the first time he did not respond immediately, and that pause, that hesitation was new, unfamiliar, and I recognized it as the moment when someone realizes they are no longer directing the conversation, they are reacting to it. William returned his attention to me then, not interrupting but re-entering the space with the same steady presence he had carried from the beginning. "My office will arrange a formal meeting," he said, and his tone was professional now, the personal recognition still present but integrated into something more structured. "There are documents we will need to review, and I would prefer that you have time to consider everything before making any decisions." And I appreciated that, not because I felt unprepared, but because it acknowledged that this was not something to be rushed, that the weight of what had been uncovered deserved more than a quick conclusion at the edge of a crowded ballroom. "I understand," I replied, and I did, not just the logistics, but the significance, the way this moment would extend beyond the evening into something more enduring, something that would require attention, intention, and clarity. As William stepped away to address others who had been waiting, the space around me shifted once more, not empty but quieter, more defined, and I stood there for a moment, aware of Daniel beside me, aware of the room around us, but no longer defined by either, because for the first time in a long while, I was not adjusting myself to fit the space I was in, the space was beginning to adjust to me. The rest of the evening moved forward, but not in the way it had been intended, not with the same easy rhythm or polished confidence that had filled the room before, because once something shifts at that level, even quietly, it changes how everything else is perceived, and I could see it in the subtle glances, in the way people who had ignored me earlier now acknowledged me with a nod or a measured smile, not out of politeness, but out of recalibration, as if they were adjusting their Understanding in real time. I did not seek those interactions, I did not move toward them or away from them, I simply existed within them differently, and that difference did not come from anything I said, it came from what had already been revealed. Daniel stayed near me, though he did not speak immediately again, and that in itself was unfamiliar, because he had always been someone who filled silence quickly, who shaped conversations before they had the chance to take a direction he did not control. But now he seemed to be waiting, watching, as if trying to understand the boundaries of a situation that no longer followed his expectations. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, not because I needed it, but because the simple action grounded me, reminded me that I was still in a room, still in a moment, still part of something unfolding in real time. And as I took a small sip, I noticed a woman approaching, someone I recognized only vaguely from earlier introductions that had not included me by name. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her tone careful but not uncertain. "It is a pleasure to meet you." And I met her gaze with a calm expression, not surprised, not impressed, just present, and I replied, "Margaret is fine," because titles, I had learned, carry weight only when they are chosen, not assigned. She smiled a little more openly now and spoke briefly about the company, about how remarkable it was to hear about the early days, about how much those decisions still influence what they were doing now. And I listened not because I needed validation but because I understood that this was part of the shift. The gradual realignment that happens when perception changes and people begin to connect the present to a past they had not previously considered. When she moved on, another followed, and then another, not a crowd, not an overwhelming attention, but a steady, measured acknowledgement that had not been there before. And through it all, I remained the same, not expanding to meet their expectations, not shrinking to avoid them, simply existing with a clarity that did not require adjustment. Daniel finally spoke again, quieter this time, his voice directed only at me. "They are treating you differently," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, and I nodded slightly because it was true, but it was not new, not really, it was simply visible now in a way it had not been before. "They always did," I said, and he frowned slightly, not in disagreement but in confusion, and I continued, "You just did not notice." And that was not said to wound him, it was said because it was the truth, simple and unembellished, and sometimes truth lands harder when it is delivered without emotion. He exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed he knew, and I could almost trace the path of his thoughts, the years of assumptions, the quiet decisions, the ways in which he had defined our roles without ever stating them out loud, and how those definitions were now being challenged not by argument but by evidence. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked, and this time the question was different, not defensive, not strategic, but genuine in a way that caught me slightly off guard, and I considered it carefully before answering, not because I did not know but because I wanted to be precise. "Because it was never something I needed to prove," I said, and as I spoke I realized that was the clearest way to explain it, not as a sacrifice, not as a secret, but as a choice, a quiet understanding that what I contributed did not require recognition to have value, at least not at the time. He nodded slowly, absorbing that, though I could see he was still processing the implications, and for a moment we stood there without speaking, not in discomfort, but in a kind of unfamiliar stillness that neither of us quite knew how to navigate. Across the room, William glanced in our direction briefly, not interrupting, not signaling, just acknowledging, and I understood that this evening, as unexpected as it had become, was only the beginning of something that would extend far beyond it, something that would require more than a single conversation, more than a single realization, and as I set my glass down on the nearest table, I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle within me, not about what would happen next, but about who I was as it happened, and that certainty did not need to be announced, it simply remained steady and undeniable, as the evening continued around us. By the time the music shifted into a slower rhythm and the waitstaff began clearing the first round of glasses, the evening had settled into something quieter, but not calmer, because calm suggests resolution, and nothing about this felt resolved, it felt suspended, as if the entire room was waiting for something it could not yet define, and I realized that I was no longer just part of that anticipation, I was the reason for it. I moved toward one of the tall windows lining the far side of the ballroom, not to escape, but to create a small space where I could think without interruption, and as I looked out over the city lights stretching across the dark skyline, I found myself remembering something Daniel once said many years ago, that success was about being seen in the right rooms, by the right people at the right time, and I wondered now if he had ever considered what it meant to be unseen in those same rooms, too. be present but unacknowledged, and how easily that absence could be mistaken for insignificance. Footsteps approached, measured and familiar, and I did not need to turn to know it was him. "You are leaving early?" Daniel asked, and there was something softer in his voice now, not the controlled tone from before, not the confident ease he carried when speaking to others, but something closer to uncertainty, as if he was still trying to find a version of this evening that made sense. "No," I said, still looking out at the city. "I am just standing where I can see clearly." And that was true in more ways than one, because clarity had nothing to do with distance, it had to do with perspective, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I had it. He stood beside me then, not too close, not distant either, and for a few seconds we simply looked out in silence, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled because it is already saying something important. "Everything they said," he began, then paused, as if choosing his words more carefully than usual. "About your involvement, about those early decisions, why did you never make that part of us?" And I understood what he meant, not just our marriage, but the life we had built, the version of our story he had carried forward, and I considered the question without defensiveness, because it deserved an answer that was honest, not reactive. "Because it was never something I needed to hold on to," I said, turning slightly toward him now, "and because I thought what we were building together mattered more than where it started." And as I spoke, I realized how true that had been for me, how willingly I had allowed the past to become background, trusting that the present would reflect the full picture, and for a long time it had seemed like that was enough. He nodded slowly, absorbing that, but I could see that it did not fully resolve what he was feeling, because this was not just about information, it was about perception, about the gap between what he believed and what was now undeniable. "I never meant to," he began, then stopped, and I did not need him to finish that sentence, because intention, I had learned, does not always align with outcome, and what matters more is what remains after the truth becomes clear. "I know," I said quietly, and I did, not in a way that excused anything, but in a way that acknowledged the complexity of how people shape their realities over time, how they simplify, how they focus on what reinforces their understanding and overlook what challenges it, often without realizing they are doing it. We stood there a moment longer, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass, and I felt something settle within me, not a decision, not a conclusion, but a readiness, the kind that comes when you stop waiting for things to return to what they were, and start understanding what they actually are. Behind us, I heard William's voice again, not directed at us this time, but present, steady, continuing the evening in a way that felt both unchanged and entirely different, and I knew that what had begun tonight would not end here, that there would be meetings, documents, conversations that carried more weight than anything said in a ballroom, but those would come later, and they would unfold in their own time. "Margaret," Daniel said again, and this time there was no attempt to shape the moment, no effort to control it, just my name spoken simply, and I turned to him fully, meeting his eyes without hesitation, and for the first time that evening, I saw not confusion, not calculation, but recognition, not just of what I had been, but of what I was and what that meant moving forward. I did not respond immediately, because some moments do not need to be filled with words, they need to be understood, and as we stood there, side by side but no longer in the same place we had been when the night began, I realized that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming something that was lost, it would be about acknowledging something that had always been there, waiting quietly until it could no longer be overlooked. The night did not end with a single moment, it unfolded slowly, like something that had been held back for years finally allowed to move forward without resistance. And as the last of the conversations began to quiet and guests started to gather their coats and exchange final words near the entrance, I found myself no longer watching from the edges of the room, no longer measuring my place within it, but simply existing in it with a clarity that did not require validation, and that difference, subtle as it might have seemed from the outside, changed everything. Daniel remained beside me as we moved toward the exit, not leading, not stepping ahead as he usually did, but matching my pace, and I could feel the shift in that alone, the absence of assumption, the presence of awareness, and for a while neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had already been understood did not need to be repeated. When we stepped out into the cool night air, the contrast between the quiet street and the brightness of the ballroom behind us felt almost symbolic, as if one space had held the version of the evening we expected, and the other held what it had become, and I paused for a moment at the top of the steps, looking out at the line of cars waiting under the soft glow of streetlights, the city moving forward in its usual rhythm, unchanged by what had shifted inside that building, And yet I knew that for me, nothing was quite the same. Margaret, Daniel said again, and there was something steadier in his voice now, not because he had resolved everything, but because he had begun to understand that resolution would not come from controlling the narrative, it would come from facing it, and I turned to him, giving him my full attention not out of obligation, but because this moment, like the others before it, deserved to be seen clearly. I see it now, he said, and the simplicity of those words held more weight than any explanation could have, because recognition, when it finally arrives, does not need elaboration, it carries its own clarity, and I held his gaze for a second longer, not searching for more, not expecting anything beyond what was already there. And then I nodded, a small quiet acknowledgement that did not erase what had been overlooked, but did not need to, because this was not about rewriting the past, it was about understanding it honestly. We walked down the steps together, not in perfect alignment, not yet, but no longer moving in separate directions, and as we reached the curb, the driver opened the car door with a polite nod, the same way he would for anyone, unaware of the subtle shift that had taken place, and I appreciated that, the normalcy of it, the reminder that the world does not pause for personal revelations, it continues, steady and indifferent, leaving it up to us to decide how we move within it. Before getting in, I glanced back once more at the entrance, at the light spilling out onto the pavement, at the silhouettes of people still inside, and I realized that I did not feel the need to return to that space as the person I had been when I arrived. That version of me had served its time, quietly, without complaint, but it was no longer necessary. I turned back and stepped into the car, settling into the seat with a calm that felt earned rather than assumed, and as the door closed gently behind me, I felt something settle into place, not as a conclusion but as a beginning, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but makes itself known through the quiet certainty of what follows. Daniel entered on the other side, and as the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the steady flow of traffic, neither of us rushed to fill the silence, because for once silence was not something to be avoided, it was something to be understood, and as the city lights passed by outside the window, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not directed at him, not directed at the night, but at the simple, undeniable truth that had revealed itself without force, without argument, without anything more than presence, that I had never needed to be placed in the light to have value, I had simply needed to stop allowing myself to be hidden from it.